We're looking at the side with the map on it. The other side was about Noah. We've covered that. But, however, does anybody have anything they want to come back to on Noah before we move on? It's okay if you do. That's what this class is for. Nothing on Noah. So let's go on to Abraham. Based on the chronology, and we'll come back to this chronology later, in Genesis 11, 10 to 26, Abraham was born about 292 years after the flood. Think about that time frame. The flood takes place, flood's over, Noah and his family are getting off the ark, and God says, be fruitful and multiply. Abram was a result of Noah and his family being fruitful and multiplying, about almost 300 years down the line, as the text goes. He was about 75 when they left Ur. If you want to go to Genesis 11, I'll pick this up here. Genesis 11, look at verse 26. Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. So who was Lot? Abraham's nephew. Now it will say that later on in the text, but this is where you first learn that. Lot was the nephew of Abraham. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And we don't have any more information on that, how Haran died. He just died. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Perhaps you've heard the joke. How many men does it take to milk a bear? Because later on in the chronology, it'll say 8 sons did milk a bear. It doesn't say that here, but it will say it later. So there's just a little bit of biblical humor for you as we get started in our class this morning. You probably won't remember anything else about this class, but you'll know how many guys it takes to milk a bear. Terah took Abram his son and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. They went as far as Haran and settled there, and the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, that's what it says they did. What I believe is that when we start what's now called Genesis 12, Moses, or God through Moses, as he writes this record down, is explaining why they left Ur to go to Haran. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you." So he was 75 when this happens, and that date, or that age rather, is recorded just a few verses down in verse 4. Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. In your notes, just above the map, it says Abram was from Ur of the Chaldeans when God called him to go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I'll show you. And then you see the map. Now, you might be wondering, as I used to wonder, why in the world did they travel up north and then go west and then go back down south? Why didn't they just cut straight across? Well, they didn't obviously have any interstate highways, and that was desert. If you wanted to go where there was plenty of food and water, what did you have to be concerned with traveling in Abram's day? If you were traveling with your wealth, what was your wealth? Cattle, flocks, and herds, sheep, ducks, geese, whatever else you might have had. And all of those critters need water, they need grass, they need grazing, they need all those things, as well as you. You need water. There were no McDonald's or anything like that. So that's why when you see people's travels in ancient times, their travels normally go along routes that will accommodate them with all the things they need. We don't worry too much about that today. It was interesting when Christy and Nick lived up in North Dakota. There were routes when Debbie was going without me, going with another lady or two. There were routes that she would not take because you couldn't get cell service in some of those places. And I remember one stretch, it said 36 miles to the next services. And then you get to those services, and it's like there's a little shack off on the side, no gas pumps. I don't know what they meant by services, but that's what it was. Of course, you could get through pretty fast because there weren't any police up there checking your speed. I'll just say that and leave it as it is.
Let me make a comment on that.
All right, Frank.
Years ago, we was coming from the state of Virginia to Oklahoma.
Okay.
In the night, way up in the night, over in eastern Tennessee, run onto a sign said the last services for gas at a certain price for so many miles.
Okay.
Well, stupid me, I pulled in and gassed up and down the road about 15 miles, it was 10 cents cheaper.
So the moral of the story is you can't trust everybody in Tennessee. That's funny. But if you stop and think about it, I think this gives me perspective, and so maybe it'll help give you perspective too. How many of you read the book that Carthel Miller wrote about his life? He came to, okay, at least one. If you didn't read it, man, we need to get some copies of it and spread that around. If you didn't know Carthel, bless your hearts, you missed a great man. But he died here a few years back, and he had written a brief book about his growing up days. Came to Oklahoma in a covered wagon from, and I think it was Arkansas, but from Texas. Okay, yes, that's right. So that was Carthel Miller, and he wasn't even 100 years old when he died, and so that's how far back things go. I remember meeting Polly Hill, a lady in Idaho, whose family had moved to Idaho in a covered wagon, and this was farther back than Carthel, but think about just the 20th century and all the changes in technology that we have enjoyed. And every morning when I get up and I take a hot shower, I think, man, isn't this great? How long have we had indoor plumbing with heat, air conditioning, and even air conditioning? Remember when you'd go in a store, and I'm talking to the old folks now, and they would say on the front doors, air conditioned inside. I've noticed nobody has a sign that says that anymore. Why is that? Because it's just assumed every place is going to be air conditioned. Duh, I'm not going any place it's not air conditioned. That's how accustomed we've been to these luxuries that nobody had prior to just 150 years ago. Telephones, just talking about this the other day. When they made computers in the 50s and 60s, they filled up an entire room, and now you hold in your hand, in your cell phone, a computer that will outstrip everything that they had in the 50s and 60s, that they used to put people on the moon. So consider what we have today in light of history and put that in perspective. I'm not trying to be gross or anything, but just consider the value of a Kleenex. How wonderful is it to have a Kleenex and toilet paper? Isn't that great? I don't even want to ask what people did before there was toilet paper. But it was a long time before toilet paper. Why are we talking about that in a Bible class? The reason is we're coming up on the season of Thanksgiving. Who in the world from now back through time has more reason to be grateful and thankful than we who have all of this technology at our disposal, all of these luxuries at our disposal, just to reach into my pocket and get a Kleenex? What a wonderful thing. To have a sound system that I can stand up here. I don't have to strain myself so that everybody can hear comfortably. And if it is too loud, Jacob can turn it down in the back, whatever. We've got lights, we've got heat, we've got comfortable padded pews. Boy, we have a lot to be thankful for in so many ways. And when we travel, we don't have to worry about the same things Abraham had to worry about. Later on in chapter 14, we will read that Abraham had 318 trained men. Now, in the context of Genesis 14, if you remember, what were those men apparently trained to do? Apparently trained to fight, because that's when we read about Chedorlaomer and his confederates coming to Sodom and Gomorrah and taking all the people captive, which included Abraham's nephew Lot and his family. And Abraham pursued them with his 318 trained men, slaughtered them, as the King James puts it, and then returned. Interestingly enough, I'm getting kind of ahead of myself, but not really. When he came back, who greeted Abraham? Anybody remember? Melchizedek. Who was Melchizedek? He was God's priest. But what the scriptures say of Melchizedek is that Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is a very prominent figure. And in Genesis 14, we have the only record of anything Melchizedek ever did. And what Melchizedek did was he blessed Abraham when he returned from wiping out Chedorlaomer and his confederates and saving the population of Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, they were saved, and by chapter 19, God's going to send fire and brimstone on them because apparently they were not thankful for what they had been blessed with and pursued a lifestyle of sin. Anyway, that's just part of the history that we're looking at here in Abram's life. And he came up from Ur of the Chaldees, went down to the land of Canaan, and God told him, this is the place I'm going to give your descendants. What two ways did God picture Abram's descendants for him? As numberless as grains of sand and the stars in the heavens. We'll look at this later, but I wanted to bring several things up to kind of get us an introduction to Abraham this morning. The stars in the heavens reference is especially interesting to me because without telescopes, men did not know how many stars there were, and they conjectured by what they could see that there were several thousand. And so when God tells Abraham that your descendants are going to be like the sand of the sea, if there were only several thousand, that wouldn't have been very many. But what do we know now about the stars? They're numberless. They are numberless. So whoever wrote Genesis, when they recorded God telling that to Abram, knew something about the number of the stars, and the only way they could have known that then was by God himself. That was revealed to Moses as he wrote this down. Well, actually, all Moses did was write it down. It was something that God knew and was telling Abram. So what we're seeing in that promise alone is foreknowledge that came before men had knowledge of how many stars there were. I don't know if I'm making that clear at all, but that's a reference to a scientific fact that nobody had before telescopes were invented, which I find very interesting and fascinating. All right, anybody got anything? All right, back to your handout. Under the map, it says, God made Abram a number of promises when he called him to leave Ur, and these are all in Genesis 12, first part of it. He would lead him to a particular land. We now know that land was Canaan. He would make of him a great nation. Did he do that? He did that. Now here's another interesting thought. God brought Israel into existence through Abraham. Can you think of any nation or any people down through time that's been more persecuted than the Israelites? When you go back through history and you look at people who are persecuted, whether it was in the first century, way before that, they were persecuted by the peoples they lived around because they came into Canaan and they fought with those people constantly. But they were persecuted in Russia, they were persecuted in Europe, not just in World War II. When the plague came through, when the bubonic plague hit Europe, a lot of people blamed the Jews and so persecuted the Jews because the Jews practiced biblical hygiene. When you read what the text says about what God told the Israelites to do, said when you go forth to relieve yourself, you take a shovel and you have that among your tools, among your weapons, so that when you relieve yourself, you can cover that up. and other kinds of washings that the Jews did. They were clean and much cleaner than the normal people who lived in Europe, who, well, if you could imagine what it might have been like without all the nice luxuries we have today. That's why the bubonic plague spread. It spread through filth. And the Jews were immune to that because they lived to themselves and they had a higher standard of hygiene. So when people saw that the Jews did not get the bubonic plague, they said, well, what do you must be causing this. That's how people thought sometimes. And since you don't have what we have, we're going to blame you for it, and persecuted the Jews. But all through history, the Jews have been persecuted, and yet what nation always seems to flourish? Everywhere you go in the world, there are Jews, and where you find Jews that are flourishing. In spite of Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof is a great story, and it tells the story of the persecution. Nevertheless, through the persecution, the Jews still prosper. Why in the world is that? What other nation has suffered like the Jews have suffered and still continues to do well? Maybe it's because
came out of the San Joaquin Valley there in California, and would have been anyway, the point of the story is, apparently there was a farmer that had all this lettuce or cabbage or something. Apparently there was a freak, and he told this Jewish gentleman that had these crops that, I'll buy that, I'll take that off the menu. Well, then whatever it was,
Hey, Jeffrey.
whatever the weather effect that was on that actually didn't have an effect on it. And the Jewish gentleman took it so hard that he got taken by a Gentile that he committed suicide. So, for us to understand that, and I've thought about that story, and I think about the stories about how the Gentiles looked at the Jews, and the Jews kind of put themselves over them. Of course, they were God's people. I really still, to this point, and even with the bubonic plague that you was telling stories about how they were clean and they've been persecuted, I never really thought about, I knew they were persecuted, but then you talk about how they flourished. But one of the reasons, because they were so good at business, I still don't quite get the whole picture. And that sounds really silly, but to see how if a Gentile had gotten the best of one of them, that they would react. I just didn't quite understand that. I see it, I hear it, I understand it, but I really don't.
Well, it may be because there's no more unique people on the face of the earth than the Israelites, the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, because God didn't choose a nation, He chose a man, and from that man He brought a nation into existence. And Jacob, remember his name was changed. What was Jacob's name changed to? Israel. What does the word or the name Israel mean? It means he who struggles with God. Jacob was wrestling with the angel, and the angel said, okay, your name's not going to be Jacob anymore, it's going to be Israel, he who struggles with God. And of course, Jacob was the downline from Abraham, and from Jacob came the 12 sons of Israel, and all those boys seem to have their struggle with God. Every man does, every human being does, every man, every woman, every child will grow up to have their struggle with God because of the flesh. But it seems that that struggle has been embodied in the nation, the people of Israel and the Hebrews, and we see that. And as we see that, we see God's relationship with all of humanity. And it's poetic, but it's also very practical, very pragmatic, that this is a nation of people who's been persecuted through the years, but they still exist. They don't just exist, they flourish wherever they are. And we might attribute that, somebody might try to attribute that to their simple talents and skills, but I think it's much more than that. I think it's based on one of the promises God made him, that He would bless him and He would make His name great, that he would be a blessing, that He would bless that God would bless those who blessed Abraham's offspring, and He would curse those who cursed Abraham's offspring, and that in Abram all families of the earth would be blessed. Now that's an obvious reference, and Paul will later refer to that in the person of who? How would Abraham bless all families of the earth? Who's the one offspring? And this is so obvious. It's Jesus. Jesus is in the downline of Abram. Now, of course, Jesus was the Son of God, but he was also the son of Mary, who was Abraham's downline. So I just think all this stuff is fascinating, intriguing, however you want to call it. All right. Oh, I got a new work page. JC, could you help me again? Oh, do you mind? That's this one up. This one is, it's about Abram. It will deal somewhat with the chronologies again. I like to keep coming back to these, reminding us of the time frame and the years. And the reason I'm doing that is twofold. It's because God put them in the book. Chronologies in chapter 5 of Genesis and in chapters 10 and 11, especially chapter 11, to tell us this is how many years all this stuff took. And this is when this happened, that's when that happened, this is when this guy begat that guy, and when he was so old, when he begat this guy. And the other reason is we hear so much about the world being billions and billions of years old when God says, no, I made everything 6,000 years ago. And of course, everything we talk about having an appearance of age, everything did at the beginning, had to have an appearance of age. You buy a car, you go down to the showroom. How are you going to know when it was made? Well, you can't just look at it unless you're looking at that sticker that says when it was made. Otherwise, you're just taking a guess. You take that car, you put it in storage in a good place where it's heat controlled, temperature controlled, humidity controlled. You pull it out in 50 years, it'll look the same. It'll be out of style, maybe, but it'll look the same. And when God created Adam, if you'd have been standing there and you looked at Adam, how old would you have said he would have been? I don't know, 25, 30, 40? If you wanted him to be right, he'd have said 63. So that's probably what Adam looked like. I think he was 63, a real man, you know. I thought that would get more laughs, but I guess it's the ridiculousness is just not obvious or something. When everybody gets the worksheet, we'll get started on that one. No hurry. Anybody got anything about Abraham so far you want to talk about or discuss? Any observations or questions? Now, if you raise your hand, I don't know if you're trying to get a worksheet or want to ask a question. Everybody got a worksheet? Got a white one? Okay. Start at the top. Abraham is mentioned at least 69 times in the New Testament. In the New Testament. So he's a prominent figure in the New Testament. All of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the gospel writers include references to Abraham. Obviously, Matthew and Luke record references in the genealogies, but they have more than those. And they record the times that Jesus mentioned Abraham. You might put that in your notes. Luke records several mentions of Abraham, in the book of Acts. In Acts. Now, Luke is not necessarily writing theologically about Abraham, but he's reporting what others are doing. When sermons were preached in Acts, leading people to believe in Jesus, one of the places they started with was Abraham. Start with Abraham and how God promised to make of him a great nation, and that's who we are, and promised that he would bless all peoples through him. So those are some of the things said about Abraham as recorded in the book of Acts. Blank, blank, blank mention him in their letters. That would be Peter, Paul, and James. All three of those writers mentioned Abraham in their letters. So he has a very prominent place in the New Testament and in the gospel. So let's put Abraham in a chronological perspective. Peleg. You'll find his first reference in chapter 10, verse 25, and also in chapter 11, 16 to 19. He seems to be the peg, if you will, upon which the timing of Babel and the division of languages can be hung. 10:25 says that in Peleg's day the earth was divided. Let's go there. 10:25. Excuse me. Two sons were born to Eber. Now, do you remember what I speculated about Eber a week or two back? That's where the Hebrews perhaps got their name, because we don't know where else they would have gotten the name Hebrew. We know Hebrews are Israelites, that's how the word's used, but it may be from this fella, from this ancestor, Eber, however that worked out. It would make sense, but we don't have an explanation. We don't have a statement saying that. It's just conjecture, but it's, I think, pretty good conjecture. Two sons were born to Eber. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. In his days the earth was, I don't know what that could mean, except that Babel took place. Now there was the division of the continents that seems to have taken place probably in the process of the flood. Anybody ever heard about the one continent? My goodness, now I can't even think of the name of it. Pangea. I kept wanting to say Patagonia, but it wasn't Patagonia. It was, now you'll think of Patagonia. It was Pangea. There was one continent, and in the course of the flood, of all that tectonic upheaval, God probably split that one continent up into the ones we have now. And if you look at the continents, if you look at the shorelines and the shapes, and especially if you can get a map that shows you what the continental shelves look like off the coast, underwater, you'll see, yeah, it looks like you could just pull them all together and they would fit perfectly into one continent. And so there probably was, during Noah's day and the time of creation, one large continent that was gathered together in one place, like Genesis says, and the waters were gathered together in one place. But after the flood, that continent must have broken up and become several different continents. So that was a division of the earth, but I don't think that's the division we're looking at here. I think what we're looking at here is the division of people at Babel in Genesis 10:25. Notice also in 10:25, this is just kind of a side note, two sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And then it gives the lineage of Joktan. Why doesn't it give the lineage of Peleg at that point? Because it's going to give that later, because Joktan, they're going to throw that in there because, well, you know, he was a son too. But the one that's important is Peleg, his lineage, and he's going to be given later on. So that's in chapter 11. All right. Where are we here? The second little bent arrow, from Peleg's birth to Abram was 191 years. Peleg would have lived 48 years into Abram's life because he lived to be 239. But remember, it says that in Peleg's days, the earth was divided. If that's talking about Babel, then we're looking at a time reference for when Babel would have taken place with regard to Abraham being born. Assuming Babel was before Abraham's time, why is it possible that the text might allow that it was during Abraham's time? And that's because 10:25 says that the earth was divided in Peleg's day, and Peleg lived into Abraham's life. He was still alive when Abram was born, so it's possible, technically, that the earth could have been divided in Abram's day, but it doesn't seem like that's the way it was. But assuming Babel was before Abraham's time, the window is therefore narrowed to less than 191 years. Since the name Peleg, division, that's what the name Peleg means, P-E-L-E-G, is apparently in reference to Babel, it seems likely that Babel would have been around the time of his birth rather than the time of his life. Does that make sense? Okay, because you wouldn't call somebody a name based on a historical event after they were 50, 60, 100 years old. You'd probably give them that name at their birth because of this great historical event that took place, which was the division. So, from the creation to the flood, that's the two blanks there. From the creation to the flood, the Bible accounts for about 1,656 years. From the flood to Babel, based on Peleg's lifetime, we have no less than 101 years, which I believe is the probable time frame, but no more than 292 years. Abraham was born about 290 years after the flood, and no more than 191 years after the division at Babel. It would have been great if God would have outlined all this, but he didn't. He gave us all the information, and I kept looking at this, thinking, man, I got to figure this out. I got to know. How long after Babel was Abram born? Was it because I read something that said by the time Abram was born, Babel was ancient history and the flood was ancient history. Well, no, it wasn't. It wasn't ancient history. It was pretty recent history as things go. Just within a few hundred years, 290 years after the flood, that's when Abram was born. Wow. To me, that's interesting. And that tells me something about how humanity had flourished in that almost 300-year time that people were living all over the place, just like God had said. Remember that lesson a few weeks ago on the Chinese characters? That El Shaddai was the name, one of the names by which the Israelites knew God, and the Chinese knew God as their one God, the monotheistic God they worshipped as Shangdi, which sounds like Shaddai, and that the characters told the story of creation and the flood. I just find all that fits perfectly with what we're reading here. Abram's life, there's no blank to fill in here, is primarily recorded in Genesis 11:26 through 25:11. That's when he was born, and then he died, and everything that happened is between those texts. Abraham is called the progenitor or the original ancestor. Original ancestor. You see in the word progenitor, first, and genitor, generation or generator. The first generator, God generated through him the nation of Israel. Abraham is called the progenitor or the original ancestor of the Israelites. God did not select a nation, but a man. We need to remember that point. And the Hebrew writer says that man was as good as dead. As good as dead is what the Hebrew writer says, chapter 11, verse 12. Why did he say that? He was. Remember how old he was when he left Ur to go to Canaan? Chapter 12, verse 4 says he was 75. That's when God made him the promise that he's going to give him a son. How long did it take God to fulfill that promise? And no, that's the wrong way to say that. That's the wrong way to ask it. How long did God take to fulfill it? That's a better way to ask. 25 years. Abraham was 100 years old, so he was past the age of having kids, and the Hebrew writer, through the inspiration of the Spirit, says he was as good as dead. But he wasn't dead. He was very much alive, and through him came this entire nation. Now, that's the way God does things all the time. I would think if you want to start a people, you want to start a nation of people, get some young buck who's just thriving to have kids. What's God do? He finds this old couple out in the desert. And yeah. But why isn't that cooler and better? It's more impressive. Yes, that's God. That's the God that we worship. He does things that you wouldn't believe could be done or even should be done, but that's the way he does it because he's God and he knows the right way it ought to be. So he picks this guy, and that woman chose Sarah too. And what did Sarah do when she heard about this? She laughed. What did God do with that laughter? He used that laughter to give the promised son his name. What does the name Isaac mean? But he laughed. See how all this comes together? And why wouldn't she laugh? She was 65 when Abraham was 75. She was always 10 years younger, which makes me feel good because Debbie's 6 years younger than I am. You know what occurred to me after we were married? When I was graduating high school, she was in 6th grade. Boy, that's a perspective right there. But she's done all right. She's made a pretty good wife. Y'all aren't going to tell her anything about this, are you? The last line, Paul wrote in Galatians 2:23-29, that by blank, all Christians are blank of Abraham. What would you fill in? By faith. All Christians are children of Abraham. That's what Paul wrote in Galatians 3:23 and 29. Let me make a halfway apology for not going more into the text this morning. Next week, we'll go into the text and we'll read specific passages about Abraham and talk about that. But I just wanted to get some of these things up front, not out of the way, but up front by way of introduction, so that as we start reading about Abraham, you'll have all this stuff hopefully in the forefront of your mind. Why is it, however, that why would Paul say that we are children of Abraham? What's that all about? What did Abraham do that's brought up time after time after time? I'm sorry? Yes, God used him to make a nation, but the thing about Abraham that's brought up time and time again is, what's that?
God did was he was willing to sacrifice his son, which mirrors what God did with Jesus. Only God let Jesus die for us, and he didn't let Abraham's son.
Right.
Save him.
That's an important point about his life and an important lesson that God, I think, teaches us at that. But what I'm talking about, what I'm referring to is Abraham's faith. Faith. That's what Abraham is famous for, and that's what is driven home time and time again in the Scriptures. When it comes to salvation, it's not going to be me being saved because I've learned to be a really good person. All I've learned about being a good person is what I should be doing, and normally that just helps me to see what I'm not doing that I should be doing, or what I shouldn't be doing that I am doing. I know the law, you know the law, but I also know me and you know you, and we don't measure up. And no matter how, if we go from being 2% good to 90% good, are we still good? We are not good. If you went to a restaurant this afternoon and your waitress brings you a glass of water and says, now this is 90% clean right here, would you drink it? We are not good. We are not clean. And you're not even going to get 90%, I don't think. But God doesn't measure by percentages. What does he measure by? He measures by faith. And as Abraham had faith in God, we have faith in God. And our faith is essentially the same as Abraham's, and that's why God says, I'm going to save you. Abraham was saved just like we're saved, by his faith. Now, we live under a different time, and Jesus taught, put your faith in me, repent of your sins, confess me, and be baptized. Abraham didn't have to do all that, but he did believe in God. And that faith is the basis of salvation. That's why when Paul wrote in Romans, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God to salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek, for in it is revealed what? In it is revealed the righteousness of God from, what's the next line? From faith to faith. From the faith of the first people who knew about God to the faith of the last people who will be on the earth when the Lord comes again. Salvation is always going to be by faith. And when it says that in the gospel is revealed the righteousness of God, he's talking about the fact that in the gospel, in the death of Christ, God pays for sin. He would not be righteous, he would not be just if he did not pay for sin. How could he save me if he doesn't pay the debt that I owe? You can't do that and still be just and righteous, but God showed himself, he proved himself righteous because he paid for sin on the cross. And so when it says from faith to faith, we've got salvation. That salvation is through Jesus, and God proved himself just by forgiving our sin through Jesus. That's what that is all about. So we'll come back to this idea next week as we study Abraham some more. Anybody got anything as we close? All right. Thank you so much for being here. Lord bless you.